The radio crackled with confused voices long before anyone understood what they were seeing. High above the cloud tops, the sky was suddenly empty. Moments earlier, a full German fighter flight had filled this airspace, tight formation, engines roaring, contrails slicing white scars across the blue. Now, only drifting smoke remained. Long, curling trails fell toward the earth like fading signatures of violence. Somewhere far below, explosions echoed faintly through the clouds. And in the center of it all, one Allied fighter flew alone. No escort. No formation. No visible damage severe enough to explain what had just happened. Ground control demanded answers over the radio. Other pilots asked the same stunned question in different ways. Where did they go? Did they disengage? Was there another squadron we didn't see? The pilot in the solitary fighter didn't answer immediately. His breathing was steady. His hands still tight on the stick. Fuel gauges hovered dangerously low. His ammunition counters showed almost nothing left to give. The cockpit smelled of hot metal and burned powder. Only minutes earlier, that same pilot had been completely surrounded. He had been facing a textbook German interception, a full flight of enemy aircraft moving with precision that had destroyed countless Allied pilots before him. The kind of formation you did not attack. The kind you ran from, or hoped your escorts could break before it closed. Instead of retreating, he had turned straight into it. And now the sky was quiet. Far behind enemy lines, German radar operators were reporting fractured returns. Scattered blips. Multiple emergency transmissions cutting off mid-sentence. Luftwaffe command searched for an explanation that did not exist yet. In the air above them, surviving German fighters were already breaking away from the wider sector, abandoning patrol zones they had been ordered to hold. Something had gone terribly wrong in just a few minutes. The lone Allied pilot finally keyed his microphone. His voice was calm. Controlled. Almost detached. Enemy formation, neutralized. There was a pause on the channel. Then disbelief. Then overlapping demands for clarification. No one spoke the words out loud yet, because no one wanted to be the first to confirm the impossible. You did not wipe out an entire enemy flight alone. Not in minutes. Not in open air. Not against experienced German formation doctrine. And yet the evidence was drifting all around him. This was not the result of brute force. It was not luck. And it was not a maneuver taught in any flight manual used by either side in the war. What had just happened was the byproduct of a decision that violated every accepted rule of survival in aerial combat. A decision so reckless that no commanding officer would have approved it. A decision so precise that once it began, there was no way to stop its consequences. Long after the smoke dispersed and the shock reports reached command headquarters, analysts would struggle to describe what they had just witnessed. Not because they lacked the data, but because the data pointed to a type of thinking that did not belong in defensive air doctrine at all. This was not a fight that followed the rules. It was the moment those rules quietly began to die. And before this day was over, one pilot's insane decision would force both sides of the war to rethink how men would fight and survive in the sky forever. Before there was a cockpit, before there was an enemy in his sights, before there was even the idea of flight in his life, he was an ordinary man with ordinary fears. He grew up far from airfields and factories, in a place where the horizon was wide and the pace of life was slow. His world revolved around sunrise and sunset, seasons and routines. He was not raised on stories of war or glory. Danger was not something he chased. It was something he avoided. Those who knew him in those early years later described him as careful, quiet, observant, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke and thought longer than most before he acted. He worked with his hands. Hard, patient labor that rewarded consistency, not daring. Machines were part of his life long before airplanes were, engines, tools, systems that had to obey rules or they failed. From those machines, he learned a truth that would later shape everything he did in combat: systems collapse not from strength, but from disruption. A small failure in the wrong place could bring down something far larger than itself. When the war arrived, it did not feel heroic at first. It arrived as an interruption. A tearing away from the predictable world he understood. Friends left. Then more friends. Then the letters began to arrive from places he could not find on any map he owned. When his own notice came, he did not celebrate it. He folded it in silence and placed it carefully in a drawer as if that could somehow slow what was coming. He did not volunteer for aviation because he dreamed of battle. He chose it because he believed it offered the highest chance of control in a world quickly losing it. To him, flight was not romance. It was geometry. Angles, closure rates, timing, spacing. If chaos was unavoidable, he reasoned, then the only defense was understanding it better than anyone else. Flight school was where he began to stand apart, not through aggression, but through questions. While other cadets focused on speed, he focused on convergence. While others obsessed over aerobatics, he asked instructors why formations failed under stress. He spent hours in briefing rooms long after lectures ended, studying diagrams that most pilots glanced at only long enough to pass their exams. His instructors did not know what to make of him. He wasn't flashy. He didn't chase attention. But he consistently predicted outcomes that surprised seasoned officers. When shown simulated engagements, he often pointed to the place where failure would begin, not where the guns fired, but where hesitation entered a pattern. That unsettled people. Discipline came easily to him. Recklessness did not. And yet, buried beneath that calm exterior was a mind that constantly searched for weak points, not in aircraft, but in behavior. He watched how pilots reacted under pressure. Noticed how fear compressed decision-making. Observed how even the most experienced men reverted to instinct when timing collapsed. By the time he reached operational training, he had already formed a quiet conclusion that would later defy every rule he would be ordered to follow. Most pilots did not lose fights because they were outflown. They lost because they reacted instead of acted. His first experiences in combat aviation only deepened that belief. He watched friends vanish in seconds after doing exactly what doctrine demanded. Tight formations shattered by perfectly executed German coordination. Textbook intercepts that left no space for improvisation. Again and again, he saw the same pattern repeat. When both sides followed the rules, the side with initiative survived. The war in the air, he realized, was not decided by courage alone. It was decided by timing, by who forced the other to make the first mistake. Quietly, without telling anyone, he began building a different way of thinking about survival. Not as endurance. Not as evasion. But as disruption. When he was finally assigned to his combat unit, the veteran saw nothing threatening in him. He was polite. Soft-spoken. Not the image of a predator in the sky. Some assumed he would learn quickly or be replaced just as quickly. None of them knew what he had been studying in silence. None of them knew that while they practiced how to escape a kill, he was searching for how to collapse an entire formation from the inside. And none of them yet understood that fear, to him, was not something to outrun. It was something to redirect. The German formation was not just a group of airplanes. It was a machine. Each aircraft in it had a role. Each pilot knew not only where to fly, but how the man beside him would move, how the man above would react, how the entire structure would tighten, turn, and strike as one body. It was discipline turned into geometry, and it had been perfected over years of air war. Allied pilots had names for it. The box. The funnel. The kill throat. Whatever they called it, the result was always the same. When a German flight committed from the right distance, at the right angle, with the right spacing, escape became mathematics, and most of the time, the numbers favored the enemy. He saw it for the first time from a distance that felt safe. For specks at the edge of the sky tightening into 8, then 12 as reinforcements slid into place like teeth in a closing jaw. The radio filled with calm, professional German coordination. The pilots did not shout. They did not rush. They built the attack the way engineers built a bridge, slowly and without waste. Then they struck. What followed lasted less than 2 minutes. 2 Allied fighters fell almost at once. One spiraled into cloud without ever transmitting a word. The other tried to break upward and vanished in a flash of cannon fire. The German formation did not scatter. It flowed. It reshaped itself even as it fired, filling the gaps left by men who had just died. When it was over, the sky returned to silence as if nothing had happened. In the debriefing room later, officers used words like overwhelmed and outmaneuvered. The maps were marked with arrows and times and distances. Losses were counted. Ammunition expenditure was reviewed. Standard responses were reinforced. But none of it answered the one question he could not stop thinking about. Why did the formation never fail? He reviewed reports from other squadrons. Different days. Different weather. Different pilots. Always the same description. The Germans would shape the sky first. The Allied pilots would react second. And reaction, no matter how skillful, always came too late when timing favored the attacker. Over the next several missions, he watched the pattern repeat again and again. Sometimes he saw it from close range. Sometimes from high cover. Sometimes only through frantic radio calls that cut off too quickly. What disturbed him most was not the Germans' accuracy. It was their patience. They did not rush into range. They did not take shots early. They waited until the geometry was perfect. Until escape routes narrowed. Until reaction time shrank to almost nothing. They let the formation do the killing as much as the guns did. He began sketching what he saw on scraps of paper between sorties. Shapes. Vectors. Timing windows. The narrowing angles where choice disappeared. Most pilots focused on where they were shot from. He focused on where the attack began to become unavoidable. Soon he noticed something subtle. Every successful German attack passed through a brief, fragile phase, a moment when the formation was neither fully defensive nor fully committed. A phase where the pilots were adjusting spacing, synchronizing speeds, confirming alignment. It lasted only seconds. Sometimes less. But during that phase, the formation was at its most vulnerable. Not physically. Psychologically. That was when every pilot was still thinking. Still coordinating. Still divided between what he was doing and what the others were about to do. Once the attack began, thinking stopped. The formation became instinct. He started asking careful questions of veterans. Quiet ones, so as not to sound reckless or naive. Before the attack really begins, what do they do? Adjust. Respace. Confirm. Line up. Every answer reinforced the same point: there was a narrow window where coordination mattered more than courage. On his next mission, he saw that window open clearly for the first time. The German flight appeared at long range, still loose, still shaping inward. He watched as the lead element slowed slightly to allow the rear to compress. The formation was not yet a weapon. It was still becoming one. The temptation to fire early was strong. But doctrine forbid it. He held position. Waited. And exactly as predicted, once the formation locked, the attack became unstoppable. 2 more Allied aircraft were lost in seconds. The formation exited intact once again. That night, he sat alone in the dim light of the barracks with his maps and notes spread across the table. He drew the formation again. And again. And again. Each time he erased the edges and circled the center. Not the leader. Not the flanks. The center. That was where information converged. That was where hesitation multiplied. That was where a single disturbance would not be isolated, it would echo. The problem, he realized, was not killing individual aircraft. The problem was breaking the system that made them deadly. But there was a reason no one had tried to do it his way before. To reach the center of a German formation, you had to fly directly into it. Not around it. Not away from it. Through it. Every survival instinct said that was madness. Every manual said it was suicide. And yet, for the first time since he entered the war in the air, he felt he could finally see a crack in the machine. He did not share the thought with his squadron. He did not write it in any report. He carried it alone into the next briefing. Because he knew that the idea he was now considering would not be seen as innovation. It would be seen as insanity. The idea did not arrive like a flash of inspiration. It grew slowly, the way dangerous ideas usually do, quietly, logically, and in isolation. In the days that followed the latest losses, he stopped thinking about individual dogfights and began thinking about time itself. Not minutes. Not seconds. Fractions of seconds. The tiny delays between what a pilot saw and how fast his hands responded. The invisible gap between a command being given and the formation actually changing shape. He borrowed what he needed from wherever he could find it. Gunnery tables. Engineering handbooks. Old flight training diagrams that most pilots had forgotten existed. He was not searching for a new way to shoot. He was searching for a way to interrupt thinking. Again and again, he returned to the same conclusion: the most lethal moment in any coordinated attack was not the strike. It was the moment just before it, when the formation was still a decision, not yet an action. German formations, for all their discipline, relied on perfect timing. Every pilot had to trust that the one beside him would hold speed. That the one behind him would maintain spacing. That the one above him would not drift. That trust took place in the mind before it took place in the sky. And trust could be broken. He began to run the idea through his head as if it were a mathematical experiment. If one aircraft entered the center of a closing formation at the exact moment coordination was peaking, the formation would face an impossible choice. Hold spacing and risk collision, or break spacing and lose synchronization. Both options destroyed the attack. The risk, of course, was that the aircraft attempting this would be torn apart long before the disruption could take effect. Every survival instinct in him argued against the concept. Dive away. Climb out. Preserve energy. Live to fight again. Those instincts had kept him alive so far. But none of them had stopped the Germans from killing his friends. To test the theory safely, he started small. On patrols where German fighters appeared at long range but did not commit, he watched what happened when Allied aircraft turned suddenly toward them instead of away. Even without firing, the German pilots reacted defensively. They adjusted spacing. They slowed coordination. The formations became cautious. Less efficient. On one occasion, when a German pair began to align for a distant attack, he pushed forward briefly, not close enough to engage, just close enough to be noticed. The German leader broke alignment immediately. The wingman followed a half-second late. That half-second stayed in his mind longer than anything else he had seen in combat. Half a second was the difference between geometry and chaos. He confided none of this to the men who flew beside him. He knew how it would sound. He knew the words they would use. Crazy. Suicidal. Another pilot looking for glory. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. He was not searching for heroics. He was searching for certainty. Before the next major mission, he attempted to raise the issue carefully during a tactical discussion. He spoke in the language of spacing and disruption rather than attack and risk. He pointed to the vulnerability during formation compression. He suggested that the enemy depended too much on perfection. The room went quiet. A senior officer finally shook his head. "You're proposing to fly into the kill zone before we even start defending. That's not a tactic. That's a funeral plan." Another added, "If you're wrong by even a fraction, you won't live long enough for anyone to learn from it." He did not argue. There are moments when a man realizes that an idea cannot be sold. It can only be proven. The mission that would decide everything was briefed 3 days later. High-value target. Heavy enemy presence expected. Long exposure time over hostile airspace. Escort coverage uncertain due to weather. Every pilot in the room understood what that meant. Losses were likely. The Germans would not miss an opportunity like this. As the briefing concluded, the same familiar instructions were repeated. Maintain formation. Respond to attacks as trained. Preserve ammunition. Do not pursue. Do not break alignment. He listened carefully. He said nothing. On the flight line before takeoff, a veteran pilot clapped him on the shoulder and said, half in jest, "Today's not the day for experiments." He only nodded. As his engine warmed and the vibration settled into its familiar rhythm, he reviewed the sequence one last time in his head. Speed. Angle. Closure. Timing. No improvisation. No hesitation. If the moment came, it would have to be seized completely or abandoned entirely. There would be no middle ground. By the time the aircraft lifted from the runway and joined the rising formation, the idea was no longer a theory in his mind. It was a decision waiting for its moment. Crossing into enemy airspace, the radios filled with routine reports. Altitudes confirmed. Bearings checked. Clouds ahead. Clear skies beyond. Somewhere far ahead of them, German pilots were doing the same calculations from the opposite side of the war. When the first contact call came, his pulse did not change. Multiple bogeys. High. Closing. He looked toward the distant specks tightening into familiar shapes. The formation was beginning to build itself, slow, precise, deliberate. Just as he had seen so many times before. The window was opening. And this time, he would not wait for it to close. The first warning came not by sight, but by rhythm. Engines that had been distant and indistinct settled into a unified pulse, a deep, rising hum that meant many aircraft were moving as one. He scanned high and left, then high and right, his eyes tracing the faint silver edges of wings as they emerged from the sun. 12 shapes tightened with mechanical patience, spacing compressing in silence, turning the open sky into a narrowing corridor. The German formation was building itself exactly as he had predicted. Behind him, Allied radios stirred with tension. Range estimates rolled in. Altitudes confirmed. Someone called out the obvious, full flight, closing fast. Another voice began reciting defensive positions. Routine instructions. Routines that had ended too many lives. He did not answer. Instead, he eased the throttle forward and felt his aircraft surge ever so slightly ahead of the loose Allied line. No sharp burst. No obvious break. Just enough movement to create separation that only a careful eye would notice. The German pilots noticed immediately. He could tell by the smallest change in their alignment, the barely perceptible hesitation as the outer elements adjusted to account for the lone aircraft now stepping out of pattern below them. The formation slowed its inward squeeze by a fraction. That fraction was everything. He climbed. Not hard. Not dramatic. A smooth, deliberate rise that placed his aircraft exactly where the center of their convergence would soon be. The distance between them collapsed with violent speed, numbers shrinking faster than the mind wanted to accept. 3,000 yards. 2,500. 2,000. The German leader held course. They expected him to flinch. At 1,500 yards, Doctrine screamed for a defensive turn. A shallow dive. Anything that widened angles and bought time. His hand stayed steady. The nose of his aircraft remained locked on the space where the Germans believed he would die. At 1,000 yards, the formation began to commit. This was the moment every German pilot was trained to wait for, the instant when hesitation ended and certainty began. The formation tightened. The spacing locked. The system became instinct. He went in before instinct could finish taking over. He pushed forward into the narrowing funnel and then, at the last fraction of a second, pitched upward, not to escape, but to pass through the formation's psychological center. The move was neither a climb nor an attack in the traditional sense. It was an intrusion, a foreign object injected into a precision machine. The Germans reacted like men who had just been asked a question they could not answer in time. One pilot rolled left to clear space. Another instinctively corrected right. A third pulled up to avoid collision. The perfect geometry shattered into competing survival instincts. He fired only after the formation broke. His first burst was short and surgical, aimed not at an isolated aircraft but at the stream of motion where 3 flight paths intersected. One German fighter shuddered violently, rolled once, and vanished downward trailing flame. The blast forced 2 others into desperate evasive turns. They clipped each other. Metal struck metal. A wing sheared. Both aircraft cartwheeled into open sky, spinning in silent, helpless arcs before disappearing into cloud. The formation was no longer a formation. It was 12 men suddenly alone. He cut across their confusion instead of pulling away. The sky was now filled with crossing vectors, aircraft accelerating and decelerating without coordination. Survival had replaced discipline. The moment he had spent months searching for had fully arrived. A German pilot attempted to regroup high, climbing too steeply in his panic. He was slow at the top of the arc, vulnerable. One controlled burst tore into the rear of the aircraft. The fighter rolled inverted, wings trembling, then fell without another movement. His fuel gauge dipped lower into the red. Another German charged straight in, anger replacing calculation. Their closure rate was terrifying. The other pilot fired first, cannon shells streaked wide as he misjudged the angle. At the last possible instant, he rolled beneath the fire and answered with a single, perfectly placed burst. The German aircraft disintegrated into fragments that scattered through the air like a storm of burning glass. 2 more German fighters attempted to reform behind him. They never finished spacing. He slipped between them before synchronization could return, forcing one to climb sharply while the other twisted down to avoid collision. The upward-moving aircraft bled speed instantly. He climbed with it, stayed just beneath its tail long enough for gravity to steal control, then fired. The German fighter pitched forward and vanished nose-first into cloud. He no longer heard the radio. There was only speed. Motion. The constant tightening and breaking of angles around him. German pilots were now attacking as individuals, no longer protecting each other, no longer shaping the battlefield as a unit. Some fled outright. Others pressed in with fury and desperation. His ammunition counters dropped with frightening speed. He felt the aircraft shudder as a cannon round tore through part of the wing. Another impact struck near the engine cowling. Warning lights flickered. The plane remained controllable, barely. He didn't slow. 2 German pilots attempted a coordinated head-on attack, converging from opposite sides. In a formation, that maneuver would have been lethal. In chaos, it was reckless. He drove directly at the gap between them. One German pilot fired too early and was forced to evade by his own tracer stream. The other misjudged distance under pressure and passed too close. Their wing tips brushed. The lightest contact was enough. Both aircraft tumbled apart as if pulled by invisible hands. The sky was now littered with smoke columns. Silence followed each one. He passed through the wreckage and realized, with a strange calm clarity, that no organized pursuit remained behind him. Only scattered survivors climbed and dove in uncoordinated arcs, unsure which direction still held threat. His gun trigger went slack. Empty. He checked again out of instinct and found nothing to give. The last of his ammunition had been spent without ceremony. Fuel was nearly gone. The sky, a moment earlier packed with danger, began to widen. 3 German fighters remained within visual range. They hovered at a distance now, close enough to see his smoke streaking from a wounded panel, far enough to reassess. They had not expected this. None of them had. He held course. He did not turn away. Instead, he continued toward them with steady wings, tracking the lead aircraft with an unmoving nose. No one in the German group knew his guns were dry. All they knew was what they had just watched vanish in fire around them. The leading German pilot broke first. He peeled off in a hard defensive roll. The others followed without hesitation. The last fragments of discipline dissolved completely. The sky emptied in widening arcs as the survivors fled opposite directions. The engagement was over. Not because one side had been outgunned, but because one side had lost the courage to remain together. Only then did he allow his aircraft to settle into a shallow descent. His hands trembled for the first time as the strain left his muscles. The engine ran unevenly. The airframe sang with damage. But he was alone now, and alone meant alive. Behind him, the sky returned to an unnatural calm. Minutes earlier, it had been a machine built to kill him. Now it held only drifting smoke and the fading remains of a formation that would never fly together again. On the radio, a stunned Allied voice finally broke through. "Say again. Enemy flight is gone?" He answered after a long breath. "Dispersed. Permanently." No one replied for several seconds. Then the channel erupted with overlapping disbelief, requests for confirmation, demands for visual checks. Friendly fighters arriving late to the sector found only destruction where a coordinated enemy force had been moments before. By the time his instrument panel warned him that he no longer had the fuel to remain at altitude, there was nothing left for him to fight. Only the long, unsteady flight back through hostile sky. Only the realization, settling heavily now in his chest, that what he had just done could never be undone, in the air, or in the thinking of those who would soon study these minutes frame by frame, searching for rules that no longer existed. He reached friendly airspace on what felt like borrowed fuel. Every vibration through the control column sounded final. The engine temperature crept toward the red. The aircraft no longer flew so much as endured the sky. When the runway finally rose beneath him, his landing was hard, uneven, almost violent, but it held. The wheels screamed, the aircraft lurched, and then it rolled to a stop in a haze of steam and scorched metal. Only after the engine cut did the silence hit him. Ground crews ran first to the wings, then to the nose, then to the control surfaces. They counted holes instead of celebrating. Shrapnel tears. Cannon punctures. Heat scars along one panel where fire had licked but not consumed. When they opened his ammunition bay, they found exactly what he already knew. Empty. Every round gone. Within minutes, officers arrived. Not his squadron leaders, intelligence. Men with clipboards and cameras. They photographed the damage, measured angles, copied serial numbers of fragments pulled from the fuselage. No one asked him how he felt. They asked him where he had been, how fast he was traveling, what altitude he had entered the engagement at, how long he had remained inside the enemy formation. His answers were clipped and precise. At the same time, elsewhere across the front, the same questions were being asked in German. Luftwaffe radar stations reported a broken contact picture where a full flight should have been. Emergency transmissions from multiple pilots cut off mid-sentence. Surviving aircraft landed at scattered bases instead of returning together. Their after-action reports contradicted one another in almost every detail except one. The formation had collapsed from the inside. What disturbed German analysts was not the number of losses. It was the way discipline had dissolved. Pilots described confusion, collisions, loss of spacing, sudden panic that spread faster than commands could correct it. The cohesion they relied on had failed in seconds. By the following morning, both sides were studying the same event from opposite ends of the war. Allied intelligence reconstructed the fight using radio logs, delayed escort sightings, and the pilot's own brief testimony. The conclusion startled even the most experienced tacticians: no conventional dogfight had taken place at all. There had been no prolonged exchange of formation attacks and defensive reactions. There had been only disruption, sudden, violent, irreversible. What he had done did not fit inside existing categories of engagement. It forced analysts to examine the fight as a system failure, not a contest of skill. Within days, a quiet ripple moved through command structures. Engagement manuals were not rewritten openly, not yet. But new language began to appear during briefings. Words like disrupt, fracture, force hesitation. Pilots were encouraged to think not only about where the enemy was strongest, but where coordination was most fragile. On the German side, the response was just as telling. Intercepted communications revealed urgent warnings moving between units. Pilots were instructed to increase spacing earlier. To avoid excessive compression during approach. To be alert for lone aircraft behaving abnormally. The word appeared more than once in their internal reports. Abnormal. What unnerved both commands most was how narrow the margin had been. The event had not unfolded over an hour. It had not required reinforcements. It had not consumed squadrons. It had taken only minutes. And it had happened because one man had struck before the machine could finish becoming a weapon. He expected punishment. Instead, he was summoned for debriefing after debriefing. Not as an accused pilot, but as a case study. Flight instructors sat in on his testimony. Tactical planners asked him to describe not what he felt, but what he calculated. Engineers listened to him speak about timing the way they listened to bridge builders discuss loads. By the end of the week, he was quietly relieved from routine combat rotations. Not as a reward. As a precaution. His experience had become too valuable to risk losing in a conventional engagement. What he had proven could not remain a secret. It would travel now, through lecture halls, through briefing rooms, through the minds of pilots who had already buried too many friends under the old rules. And somewhere across the sky the Germans were adjusting as well, because even the most disciplined force in the air could not ignore what had happened inside that broken formation. The war in the sky did not change overnight. But it shifted. And once it shifted, it would never return to what it had been before those few violent minutes. He never returned to the front the way the others did. For a time, he felt more like a witness than a warrior, moving from airfield to airfield, standing before rooms of pilots who studied him with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. They wanted the secret. A trick. A maneuver they could memorize and repeat. But what he taught them was not a move. It was a way of thinking. He spoke about timing more than firepower. About hesitation more than accuracy. About how formations failed not when they were attacked from the outside, but when they were forced to doubt themselves from within. Some pilots embraced the ideas immediately. Others struggled. A few rejected it outright. Change in war is never comfortable, even when it saves lives. As the months passed, the air battles evolved. Enemy formations spread earlier. Attacks came with greater caution. Allied pilots began to speak less about escaping traps and more about breaking them before they formed. The lessons of that single encounter traveled quietly through training syllabi and tactical briefings, stripped of the man who had first proven them under fire. When the war finally ended, he returned to civilian life without ceremony. No parades waited for him. No newspaper made him a household name. He went back to ordinary mornings, ordinary work, an ordinary rhythm that felt distant from the sky he had once torn apart. When asked, years later, about the fight that changed everything, he would only say that he had been in the wrong place at the right moment, and that many others had done far braver things without ever being noticed. History would eventually disagree with his modesty. Long after the guns fell silent, military historians traced the evolution of air combat back through the war's turning points. Again and again, they returned to those few minutes when one pilot had entered a formation that could not survive being entered, and proved that initiative, once seized, could overturn even the most perfect coordination. Modern air doctrine now teaches early disruption as a principle of survival. Pilots study formation psychology. Systems engineers design for cascade failure. The language of today's skies still carries the echo of that brief, violent lesson learned high above a battlefield that no longer exists. He never lived to see how far his ideas would travel. But every time a modern pilot learns to break a pattern instead of reacting to it, his legacy flies again, unseen, unnamed, and enduring. Sometimes history is changed not by those who follow the rules better than anyone else, but by those who recognize the one moment when the rules become the danger.